questions later on. So good evening, ladies. Thank you so much for joining us. We're absolutely thrilled to have you with us. Thank you very much if you are joining us via Eventbrite, then welcome to our masterclass. If you're a harleystreetathome.com member, welcome. And if you're watching us on Catch Up, welcome as well. Right, this evening's masterclass is brought to us by Deborah Holloway. And Debbie is a gynecology nurse consultant. She has a clinical caseload that includes a one-stop outpatient procedure clinic that provides diagnostic and operative histoscopy, insertion of intrauterine devices and systems and other minor procedures. This is all at Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital. The clinic also sees women who are premenopausal or who have postmenopausal bleeding. Additionally, Debbie co-leads a specialist menopause service with a clinic within the Haemophilia Centre for women with a bleeding disorder and gynecology problems. Debbie also teaches and runs a yearly gynecology course at King's College London, and she's the current chair of the Royal College of Nursing Women's Health Forum. Debbie has honorary fellowships from the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists and the Royal College of Nursing. Essentially, Debbie is the dog's muhakas when it comes to nursing, gynecology, and menopause. I've known Debbie for a little while. We met at a menopause event in Dublin quite a few years ago. I ran into Debbie again this year at the British Menopause Society conference and literally rugby tackled her off the stage to say, please come and talk to us at Harley Street at Home. So we're thrilled to have you here, Debbie. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, it's how the sessions run. Rowena Kivell is my co-host, and Rowena looks after all of the medical content here on harleystreetathome.com. She also looks after all of the ladies in our huge treatment, diagnosis and symptoms Facebook group. And it's really Rowena who has the ear of the members and sees what comes up, the questions that are asked. And it's often Rowena that says to me, we need to do a masterclass on bleeding, as it turns out, this evening, and hence why we've put this session together. The first part of the session is led by Rowena and Debbie in a conversation, essentially, where Rowena's going to put lots of the issues that have come up so frequently in questions in the Facebook group. But we know that you will want to ask your own questions as well. And we've literally had, I've never seen so many questions come in from members, which is wonderful. So we are absolutely keeping some time at the end for Q&As. Now, how that tends to work, if you would like to ask your question, I'm going to mute everybody for the moment, just so that we don't have too much background noise. That might mean, Debbie and Rowena, you need to unmute yourselves so you are able to go live in a moment. Yeah, the chat room is open, so you'll be very welcome to post any questions there. Alternatively, we love it when you ask your questions personally. So when we get into the Q&A, if you would like to ask a question, just go along to the little smiley face, the reactions tab at the bottom or the top of your screen. You'll see one that says raise your hand, and if you click on it, you'll get a raised hand, just like I've got against my picture now, and I'll know to come to you. What I would say is, from previous sessions, please do not wait until the last minute to ask your question. Get in there quickly, because the time goes quickly. Don't be shy. This is a totally safe place. You are absolutely, you know, with friends. Ask your questions, no questions daft, all the rest of it. You know the score from those things. So for the next sort of, I guess, 30-35 minutes, I'm going to let Rowena and Debbie take the floor, and I'll be keeping an eye in chat, so do post questions there. I will keep very quiet now and hand over to Rowena and Debbie. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nigel. I'm just going to extend thanks as well, Debbie. I'm so grateful that you're here. This is such a hot topic. I can't tell you. I hope I've done everyone justice with these questions, but I'm sure they'll all jump in at the end if I haven't. So I guess as good a place as any to start, and a question that gets asked all the time is, what bleeding pattern changes can people expect, either as part of perimenopause or through menopause itself? So a very open-ended question, but yeah. I know I'm talking to an expert. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. So the bleeding patterns that you get, so the periods start to become very, very slightly irregular for some people. So it may be that you miss one, or ones, if you have a normal cycle of maybe 21 to 28 days, it gets to be about 30, 35, then a period comes. So they can be quite subtle to start with in the perimenopause. And then gradually those gaps might get a bit longer. And it's like reverting back to when you first started having periods and you're not ovulating every cycle. So the cycles can be a bit irregular, a bit all over the place. Having said that, some people just stop their periods, never have another period, and are postmenopausal, but other people do have this transition going into it where there's lots of odd bleeding. Then if you're postmenopausal, so we define postmenopausal as not having had a period for a year or not having had a bleed for a year. If it's over that year and you've not had any bleeding, then you shouldn't be having any bleeding at all. So if you're postmenopausal, there should be no bleeding. So the red flags that I would say look out for in that perimenopausal phase would be spotting in between periods, and bleeding with sex mainly. And then obviously if you've not had a period for a year, anyone that bleeds after a year, if you're not on hormones. And that's the difference. So if you're taking HRT, the bleeding pattern might be slightly different. So the short answer is the bleeding can be all over the place, or it can be none at all, and it varies from people. So some people's cycles get shorter and some get longer, and then some have a mixture in between the two with maybe a couple of gaps. And in those gaps, you might find you get menopausal symptoms, hot flushes, night sweats, because your hormones are playing up, and then the period will come, everything will be back to normal for a little bit in the perimenopause. So
see, it could be anything type scenario.
Yeah.
So, brilliant. Menopause, a gift that gives on giving, eh?
Yes, definitely.
And apart from menopause, may as well kind of cover this one up front. Apart from menopause and fluctuating hormones, I'm guessing there can be other conditions that can trigger bleeding. And I don't really want to go down a whole road on listing all of those, because we could probably do masterclasses from here until the end of next year on those. But any sort of things that people should be aware of that they might need to have a chat with their doctor about?
I think if you're worried, if you track your periods and your cycle and you're worried about it, it's worth having a talk to someone. As I said, I'd be more concerned about intermenstrual bleeding, so a little bit of spotting in between periods. I think we should go and get that checked. Bleeding with sex is definitely one that should trigger you to go and get that checked. And then postmenopausal bleeding, so if the bleeding starts up again. Other things it can be, so obviously when you hear about postmenopausal bleeding, everyone thinks, oh, it's cancer, and that's what everyone thinks, it's going to be cancer. And just to reassure that it's a very, very small proportion of women that have postmenopausal bleeding that actually have cancer or irregular bleeding around that time. So I think it's something like 4 to 5% in most clinics. So that means that like 95, 96% or 96 people out of 100 that go to the clinic will not have cancer. So it can be changes with your hormones, as we've said. It can be things like polyps. So you can get polyps, which are like a little skin tag that's on the neck of the womb or in the womb, and they can cause irregular bleeding. It could be fibroids. So some people have fibroids inside the womb and they can cause irregular bleeding. Sometimes, but when we put things in, like we put copper into uterine coils in, that can cause heavier bleeding and sometimes irregular bleeding. Sometimes some vaginal infections can. And then later on in the menopause, if you've got vaginal atrophy, so if the lining of the vagina, if the vagina itself is quite thin, it can bleed by itself from there as well. So there can be all sorts of things. So if you are worried, everyone always thinks cancer, but it's always worth going to check these things out, because most of the time it's not cancer, and it's something that's quite easy to fix or remove or have some surgical intervention for.
Brilliant. I think there's always that fear of not knowing, and sometimes just finding out is so much better. Okay, so there are all the other things. So if we move back to sort of HRT and bleeding, which is kind of like one of the things that comes up all the time, what can people expect when they start HRT, whether they're still having periods or whether they've not had a period for a long while? What bleeding patterns could be classed as normal? And I know that's a very dangerous word to use, but what should people expect?
So when someone starts on HRT, whatever it is, we normally give 6 months settling down period. So that means whether you're still having periods or whether you're not having periods, we may expect some odd bleeding in that first 6 months. And then bleeding on HRT, again, is very common. So a lot of women experience bleeding on HRT. And there's all sorts of different reasons for that, which we can probably go through in a little bit. But so if you're on a sequential preparation, so if you're still perimenopausal and still having some periods, and you're having a regime where you get estrogen for all the time and then you get progesterone for 2 weeks, you will eventually settle down into having a regular scheduled bleed for most people, although some people don't bleed at all, and that's fine. If you're postmenopausal and not having periods after the initial 6 months, you should not have any bleeding at all. So if that carries on, that does need to be investigated. But we always give it 6 months, because it can be a bit of a shock to the body, and it does take some time to settle down.
Yeah, I think it's the really common one we get is women that are postmenopausal that obviously haven't had a bleed for a long while, and they've started on HRT, and then suddenly that sort of shock of bleeding again. Yeah. One of the terms that's always used, I'll ask you this now. There's talk about breakthrough bleeding, and then there's talk about periods, and then there's talk about just erratic bleeding. Can you talk about those different terms so that I understand what they mean?
Yeah. So if we look at periods first, periods won't, if you're postmenopausal, you shouldn't be having periods. Although having said that, we use you've got a year after your last period, and then we call you postmenopausal, or we say that's postmenopausal. It's a really quite arbitrary term, and I think I find, particularly in the clinic, the younger you are when your periods stop, the more likely you are to maybe have an odd one-off bleed where you have an odd ovulation and it's your breasts feel tender, you feel like you're going to have a period, you feel grumpy, then you have a bleed, and then we investigate and we don't find anything for it. So sometimes you can still have these rogue odd periods going on. What the bleeding you get when you're taking the HRT, if you're taking the cyclical one, you get it's a breakthrough bleed, essentially. So it's a bleed designed by the medication. It's not your own body having a period.
Right.
If you are perimenopausal at that point, you might find that you have your own hormones. So if you might be having a period every 3 months, and that may not coincide with the HRT bleed as well. So you might get some odd bleeding there. And so that would be breakthrough bleeding, and that would be bleeding just made by the HRT rather than it being your own body. It's like if you think about being on the contraceptive pill, when you have that 7-day break, that's not a period, that's just a withdrawal from the hormones, and it's the same sort of principle with the HRT, but less hormones.
Got it. There's so many terms that come through, and I think it is so confusing understanding which is which. We get a lot of women that talk about trying to synchronize, if you like, their progesterone with their normal, or what was their normal menstrual cycle. Is that something that's worth doing? Is it something that's going to change with the HRT?
So the HRT doesn't impose a cycle like the combined pill does. So if you have got some of your own hormones underneath, the HRT is going to be on top of those. So some people do find that they can sync it up, but most people find that their periods are so irregular at this time that it's really hard to do. So whereas they may have had like a 29-day cycle or a 30-day cycle and been really regular up to a certain point, it changes completely. So it can be quite hard and quite frustrating to try and do that. So I think if you're having lots of problems with bleeding, it may be worth keeping some charts and some diaries about how you feel and how you're feeling on the HRT and when the bleeding's coming. But it's quite difficult for most people to try and sync it up. Although some people do say, I normally had a period around like the 26th of each month, so I'm going to try and get the HRT around that time. And that's absolutely fine to do. That won't cause any problems.
Right, perfect. Okay, sorry, I digressed a bit there as things came to mind, but you talked about giving it 6 months or so for bleeding to settle. What happens if it doesn't settle at 6 months? We get a lot of these queries where people have had to chop and change different types of HRT, or they've been advised that it should settle and it just doesn't. What are the reasons for that, and what can people do?
So all sorts of reasons. So firstly, there may be something like a polyp or a fibroid. There may be some pathology. So if it doesn't settle at 6 months, you need to go and see someone. And I think the minimum is a vaginal examination and an ultrasound scan to see exactly what is going on there. So we might find something that is not related to the HRT at all, and that can be easily, or it can be sorted either surgically or something. So I think firstly, we need to do that. Secondly, check what HRT you're on, because sometimes if you haven't finished your periods and you're put onto a continuous HRT, so a no bleed HRT, you can be, that's the wrong HRT for your age and where you are in the menopause. So you can have lots of bleeding problems then because you're not on the right HRT. Check what you're taking. So we know that sometimes we give patches and some people just don't absorb through their skin, or we give tablets, and if someone's got a digestive problem like Crohn's, they may not be absorbing the hormones. So there may be something in the way we're giving it, or if you've got a patch that falls off every 22nd, every sort of like every hour or 2 hours or so, you may not be absorbing it properly. So you may need to look at what you're taking and how you're taking it, and is it the right one for you, and check that your prescription hasn't changed. Because sometimes we find, although we shouldn't, but sometimes we find there may have been a prescription error, so you may have been given a slightly different medication, or it's not clear how to take it. And a common one for that is Everol Sequi, because if you get the packet, if anyone's on Everol Sequi, you get 2 weeks worth of estrogen called Everol, then you get Everol Conti for the second 2. And if you're not entirely sure how to take it, so I've seen people that have been taking it by taking one Everol, and then the next time they change it's an Everol Conti, and then the bleeding's all over the place. So I think go back to basics, look at what you're on, look at how it's been, and then see if you can work out what needs to change. And you'll probably have to do that with your doctor or your nurse to work out whether it's the type, the way it's given, or what's being given that needs to change.
And you mentioned sort of ultrasound and sort of vaginal exam. A lot of people come on and talk about hysteroscopies that they're given. What does that involve, and what else does that tell you about unscheduled bleeding?
So if you have a scan that looks like the lining of the womb might be too thick, or it looks like there might be a polyp in there, or we're just not entirely sure what's happening, or you've had lots and lots of heavy bleeding and we can't find what's happening, a hysteroscopy is where we put a camera inside the womb and have a look inside, and then we can see, unlike a scan, it's an actual picture. So it's exactly like looking at a photo of my face. You see inside, you can look at the lining of the womb, you can look to see if there's any polyps or fibroids. And a hysteroscopy can be done in 2 ways. One, it can be done in outpatients. It's not a painless procedure, and the pain varies from person to person. So you may find that someone says it's equivalent to period pain, and then the next person that you see says it's really a lot more than period pain. So it's really hard to gauge who it's going to be painful for. So if you were having it in outpatients, we would normally suggest some painkillers beforehand. But you also have the option of having it done under a general anaesthetic as well. And there's risks and benefits for both ways of having it done, and no way is the right way for everyone. So it is about having that discussion about what you want to do and how you want to do it. But it does give you a good look inside the womb, and you can take polyps off that way, and you can take biopsies from the lining of the womb as well, and try and find out what's happening with the bleeding.
Makes sense. And if there is, I'm going to put this in a very, very non-clinical way, but if there is no obvious reason for the bleeding, but the bleeding just happens, is it a case of HRT is not for you, or are there a whole host of modifications, I guess, that can be made to what you're taking or how you're using it?
Yeah, there's a lot of modifications you can do. So there's lots of different HRT products, all very slightly different, all with very different progestogens. And it's normally, sometimes the bleeding is because you've got too much estrogen, so that and not enough progesterone to counteract that. And I know that's something that's come up in the British Menopause Society's latest tools for clinicians about progesterone levels. Some progestogens don't work as well as others. They're much friendlier to the body, but they don't work as well to control bleeding. If you always had heavy periods before we started on HRT, and they were heavy and irregular and had been very irregular and very heavy, some of the HRTs aren't going to be enough to control those. So it goes back to looking at your history, what you're on. We have things like the Mirena, the intrauterine system, so that can be used alongside estrogens if the bleeding is not stopping. It's normally a case of looking at the estrogen, looking at the progesterone, and then changing it around and seeing if we can get a better fix for it. Sometimes we might involve giving a little bit of extra progesterone on top, so we can do that, and taking it out of the HRT to stop bleeding like we do in general gynae. But yeah, there are always things that we can try and do. So it's not a matter of just, this didn't work for you, so you can never have HRT again. It is really frustrating, and it can be really annoying for women trying to get the right combination and having to keep changing. But unfortunately, we don't have a one-size-fits-all preparation. And it's exactly the same as if you've ever taken the contraceptive pill. You may have had to, your friend might be on it and may love it, and you might be on it and think it's just awful and it decreased sex drive and made your skin funny. So it is a very individual response to the HRT.
And with the progesterone, we get this question asked quite a lot as well. Is it possible to have too much progesterone? I think people worry that they're taking a medication and that I guess there's a chance of overdose or doing something adverse to your body.
So generally, no. You do need the progesterone to counteract the estrogen, and that's mainly what progesterone is there for. If we just gave estrogen, then you would get something called hyperplasia, which is an overgrowth of the lining of the womb, and that can give rise in 5-10 years to cancer. So you do need that progesterone. There isn't such a thing as overdosing. Some progestions are more friendly to the female body. Some are more male-like and can give you spots and different things. But really, it's a balance between what you're taking, the estrogen, what your symptoms are, and how we stop the bleeding. So there's no overdose of progesterone. Right. Some people don't like them because they do give you PMS-like side effects. But if I give you an example, so if we're treating someone with endometrial cancer that doesn't want a surgery, we might give 200 milligrams of Provera, whereas if you look in HRT, it's less than 2.5. So there's no overdose, if that helps.
And you touched on it there, that there was some updated guidance, if you like, that was released at the BMS conference. Again, we've had queries from people coming into the group wondering if they're on the right amount. Is this a conversation they need to be having with their doctor, with their prescriber?
Yeah, I think it generally is. I mean, the guidance says if you go over normal doses of estrogen, you might need to use some additional progesterone, and it didn't specify. Unfortunately, it doesn't specify what a normal dose is and what an over the dose is. If you're using something that is a preparation that you get from a chemist like Everil Conti, Everil Sequi, a Femiston preparation, if you're using estrogel with Utagestan and you're using 100 milligrams every night or 200 every day and using 2 pumps of gel. They're all standard regimes, and your progesterone should be enough if you're absorbing it all for that. What they're talking about is if you go up to maybe 100 milligram patch or 4 pumps of gel, you may need to adjust what you're giving in the progestin phase. So it's unclear as to when that extra bit gets in. So in clinic, we tend to do that on what we're giving. So if we are giving 100 milligram patch, which we would normally give additional progestogens. If we were giving 4 pumps of gel, we'd give additional progestogens. Otherwise, we might go on symptoms, and we might go on side effects, and we might go on bleeding. If someone really didn't want to increase their progestogens, then you might end up having to do more scans just to check the lining of the womb hasn't been adversely affected by the estrogen and there's not enough progesterone there to counteract it. But we've had queries from pharmacists as well, saying that women have come in with the guidance saying, I'm on Evorol Secre and I need to have some more progesterone, but you don't. If you're on a standard product that's made and that's been researched and that's the right amount there, it's when you start adding extra bits in.
We get that as a query a lot. I think people become quite settled on things like Evorol Secre, and then they need to just increase their estrogen, I don't know, by a 25 patch or a pump of gel. And of course that makes the progesterone sort of out of kilter, I guess, with the estrogen dose. So gosh, it's complicated, isn't it? The other question, this isn't on the list, but it's just come to me. The other question that we get a lot, and it seems the right time to ask it now, is there's a lot of noise made, I guess, about Utrogestan as being the best potentially because it's body identical as a progesterone. I know there are loads of other synthetic progestogens. I guess for my benefit, there is no best, is there? It's what suits the individual.
Yeah, it is what suits the individual. So we know from the current evidence that Utrogestan appears to be breast neutral, so it doesn't have any impact on the breast, and it appears to be female friendly and does help you sleep. But we also know from experience that some people taking that just feel really awful on it. So you need to balance why you're taking it and what we're giving it for, and we're not giving it to you to make you feel awful. And some of the older progestogens may have slightly less female-friendly profiles, but some of the older ones are much better at bleeding control. So if you were taking Utrogestan and you felt awful and you were bleeding all over the place and you were having a really miserable life, it's a balance of taking what can we give you that helps with all your symptoms and makes things better for you. And we've been given some of the progestogens like the northestones and the Proveras and stuff for a very long time for different things, and they are in a small amount. They're not body identical, but sometimes you need that synthetic to stop, particularly if we're talking about bleeding, to stop the bleeding. So it really is about, it's a complete balance. It's a complete looking at what are you taking and what's helping you. And if it's not helping you, it doesn't matter how great it is or how it's been manufactured as being great. If it's not helping you, then it's not helping you. So you do need to balance that up. So I think it's always worth, we see women in clinic that are very anxious about taking a different progesterone, but they find that this one's really awful for them when they want to start missing doses. And in fact, actually, it would be better to take one that suited you better.
That makes sense. Gosh, you've covered so much, and I know there's so many questions. I've got one last question, and then I'm going to throw it open and see what questions we've got. I've already seen some flashing up on screen. You covered some of it, but if someone is concerned about bleeding, we all know appointments are very tight when you go and see a doctor or a nurse at a practice. What can we as women do to kind of help our medical teams, if you like? You know, what should we keep a note of? What should we track? What should we go prepared to discuss?
So I think you need to keep a note of your bleeding, and I think you need to keep it in a diary or in an app or something so that you've got it there and know when it's happening. And I think if you are bleeding, try and think, if you suddenly wake up and you've bled, try and think how you felt the day before. Did you have sore breasts? Did it feel like a period was coming? Were you really extra grumpy just beforehand? So all of those other things. And how are your menopause symptoms? you're going to need to discuss whether you bleed when you have sex as well, or whether you have any sexual activity, and is it uncomfortable in the vagina, because some bleeding can come from the vagina as well. You'll be prepared for an examination of some sort. And if you are having postmenopausal bleeding, be prepared for normally an urgent 2-week wait cancer referral, which doesn't mean that they think you've got cancer. It means that we can fast track you through the system, and the aim is to get people through the system and out the other side knowing that they haven't got cancer, rather than we think that you've got cancer. So I think be prepared for those, but definitely have a track of it, and have it, if it's on an app, have it handy. As with all menopause symptoms, just know what you want to talk about when you go in, and know what symptoms you've been having beforehand. But if you can plot any bleeding you've had, then that's really useful.
Brilliant, fantastic. I'm going to hand it over to Nigel, because I've seen a whole load of questions popping up on screen.
Absolutely. Debbie, thank you very much. Marnie, brilliant. I can see your hand up. Thank you. I'm just going to ask a couple of questions in the chat, and then I'm coming straight to you, Marnie. Thank you. So Barbara asked, she's tried HRT twice and had a bleed twice. First time using Oestrogel and Utrogestan, second time with Oestrogel and the Mirena. After this, she just gave up, and but has now started for the third time on Oestrogel and Utrogestan. How can she address this if and when the bleed comes again? She's determined to resolve it this time. She's 67 and just wants to ask also, is there a maximum Oestrogel dose for her age?
Okay, so I think if you're having the bleeding, it depends how long you've been on it for. So as I said right at the beginning, give it 6 months and it should settle down. Make sure there's no other causes for it as well. The Mirena is a really good endometrial protection. So what we always worry about as healthcare professionals is, oh, is this cancer that we've missed? But if you've got a Mirena in it, even if you are bleeding, it's unlikely to be that. And we do have something that for some women, we don't know why, even though the lining of the womb is really thin, there's just odd bleeding, atrophic bleeding every now and again. So I would try and persevere, see what happens, but give it more than 6 months to see what happens. If that fails, then the Mirena is obviously another option to try again, if people are worried about the bleeding. For the dose of Oestrogel, if you're worried about the bleeding, I would try and keep that low to start with, because we know that if you have lots of Oestrogel and the Utrogestan, as we were saying, there can be a mismatch. So that can be one of the causes for it. So I would try and keep it within the normal 2 pumps if you're starting out on it with the Utrogestan, just so you get sorted and then see from there. But as for the maximum dose, you probably need to go and see the person that's prescribing it, because if you're not getting benefits, you may need to do some blood tests, etc., and see.
Thanks, Debbie. It sounds also like, Barbara, maybe that, it's stay with it a bit longer. Don't worry if it comes once, give it a little while. Marnie, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. 51, perimenopausal, started HRT last August. 2 pumps of Oestrogel and up to 3 on the cyclical Utrogestan. Had to stop it at the end of January for 3 months because of an operation. Started it again in May, 2 pumps in May, 3 pumps in June. Had a natural period in April. Had a bleed for the first 4 months, and then the last 2 months, so September and October, I've not had one. And in October, I upped my Oestrogel to 4 pumps. So I don't know whether to be concerned or not.
So about 20 to 30% of people on a sequential regimes don't have bleeding, so that's okay. As long as you're taking the Utrogestan, that's fine. That will be protecting the lining of the womb. If it continues not having bleeding for sort of 6 to 8 months, then it may be worth going to speak to someone about switching over to a continuous combined, because it may suggest that you're ready to have the Utrogestan every day in a smaller dose. But I wouldn't be concerned. And also because you've been on and off as well, it may just be taking a while to settle back down.
It's because it was like really regular, and then suddenly stopped, and I thought, well, I had this image of the lining of my womb getting bigger.
No, as long as you're taking the Utigestan,
Yeah.
that will be fine. If you're taking that, then that will counteract the estrogen, and that's fine. But yeah, some people, when they're getting towards the phase when their periods would have stopped for a year or so anyway, they find that their bleeding stops on the sequential, and then it's time to move over to a continuous.
Well, I do hope it continues to stop, because that would be quite nice. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Marnie. A question from Emma. So Emma has a period every 2 weeks on HRT. It's been investigated with no issues found, but she's getting fed up of having the bleed. This has been like this for over a year. She's tried to take progesterone tablets differently, but nothing works. Would a coil stop this?
So the Mirena intrauterine system would, yeah. It's got a hormone on it. It's got the progesterone on it. It's delivered very locally into the lining of the womb, so you either get light bleeding on it or none at all. And yeah, that would definitely be an option to try. Definitely something that we'd use in clinic to try and stop things. The other thing, if we didn't want the Mirena, there's a progesterone only pill that's got desoregstrel in it, so one of them is Cerazette or Sorel. We sometimes put those alongside the HRT as well. So you leave the HRT as it is and put that in, and that can work, but not quite as well as the Mirena. But if people don't want, some people don't like the idea of anything inside the womb, but I would definitely go and look for the Mirena.
Brilliant. Thank you, Debbie. And I'm right in thinking, aren't I, that it's not uncommon when somebody goes on to a Mirena that it kind of gradually reduces and reduces. It doesn't necessarily just stop overnight.
No.
Yeah. Okay. Lovely. Debbie, another Debbie's asking, I started Everall Sequi last November while still having regular periods before. She's 52. Doctor mentioned swapping to continuous. Is she likely to still bleed then, or will it stop?
So we think the average age of menopause is about 51, 52. We think most people will be postmenopausal by the age of 54. If you were still on regular periods before you started, it may be a little bit soon, and you may swap to a continuous and get lots of irregular bleeding. So if you had irregular or longer gaps leading up to the time you went on it, you're more likely now to be postmenopausal. So I think it might be a bit too soon, and you might end up having some bleeding all over the place. So you might want to wait till you're about 52 and then try then. What we normally do is say, switch over, monitor what your bleeding's like. If it's all over the place, then you're not ready, and then you go back to the sequential for another year and then try again.
Smashing. Thanks, Debbie. I keep putting my mic on and off because Ruby, the choking Jack Russell, keeps coming in and out of the office. So it's a bit disturbing. Right. So Tracy's asking, perimenopausal, been on HRT for 2 years, more recently Sandrina gel and Utigestan every 2 weeks. Period was fairly regular, 26 to 28 days. Since increasing estrogen in June to 1 milligram twice daily, started having a period every 2 weeks. It's not just a breakthrough bleed or spotting type of bleed. It's a proper 5-day period. Do you think this should settle? Could it be that I need more Utigestan since having increased the estrogen?
It could be. So I think it's worth going back to look at that, because if it's been from June, so July, August, September, October, it's sort of coming up. You could give it another couple of months to see if it settles, but if it doesn't, you may need to think about increasing the Utigestan.
Can somebody, thank you, Debbie, can someone have a Mirena and then have extra progesterone if they need it?
They can, but most people don't need it. And most people find if they've got the Mirena, that's it's more than it, although it doesn't seem, you can't equate it to what we give in HRT, it's more than enough to counteract. So if you had a Mirena, you could have 4 pumps of estrogel, or you could have 100 patch, or you could have 150 patch, or 200, because the Mirena's there and it works locally.
Yeah, it's really changed some women's lives, hasn't it? It can be really quite transformational.
And the important thing with it is to say that if you have one, you have to have it changed every 5 years. Yeah, because the rules change whether you're using it for contraception or HRT. So it's important that sometimes if you go and see someone, they say, oh, you've got a Mirena, that's fine, we don't need to do anything with it. But if you're using it for HRT, it does need changing.
Brilliant, thank you. Also, ladies, if you're thinking, Marina, you know, what you're talking about, Marina, we've got a special masterclass coming up on the Marina coil. I wish it's not a coil. I wish we never used that word.
Yeah.
That sounds like a bed spring. It sounds like something
Yeah.
horrendous going inside you. It's a tiny little thing, isn't it? It's like a cotton bud.
Yeah, and it's plastic. It's all plastic.
Yeah.
And it's about 5 centimeters. It's tiny.
It's just a ghastly word, though,
Yeah.
isn't it? It sounds so invasive. Okay. Oh, Nikki, give us a shout as soon as you're in from the netball. She desperately wants to ask a question, but she's trying to get back for quarter to 8. We are here till 8 o'clock. Simone loves her, Marina, and also wish we would just use that word IUD, and that's the end of it. Absolutely, too right. What is going on, Debbie, from a dietetic point of view? So I will often see women who are coming into clinic, they're talking about symptoms of, you know, of fatigue, of lethargy. Essentially, we're really getting to the point of realizing, right, your iron is in your boots. And when I start talking to them, there are some women who have literally had a period for months. It's literally maybe stops for a day or two, but one just runs into another one, feeling absolutely wretched, terrified about what's going on. Can you just explain a little bit of what is probably going on in those instances?
So mostly it's hormonal dysfunction. So the hormones aren't there, the lining. We normally find that if you miss a couple of periods or 3 periods or 4 periods, the lining still gets a little bit thicker and then it just bleeds and it's not stable. So it doesn't stop. It will stop for a bit and then carry on again. So it's normally a hormonal dysfunction. It can be caused by other things as well, but that's normally what it is. And if you're not used to talking about your periods or not used to going to see someone, people think, oh, it will stop tomorrow or it will stop next week. And women will put up with horrendous bleeding, like changing pads every hour, not able to go out, using double plaids, flooding everywhere. There's medication that you can use that's non-hormonal to stop it. So some things like tranexamic acid. So it is worth going to see someone, because even if you don't want to take any hormones, there's stuff we can do. We probably do need to investigate if your bleeding is like that. So it's really important that you go and see someone. We might not find anything. We might just find the hormones are responsible for it, but it's good to peace of mind to know that there's nothing suspicious going on. And then trying to put things back into sync. We can use just progestogens as well to try and stop the bleeding while we get on top of what's happening. So do some investigations and things. So there is all sorts of things we can do for it. But yeah, and women traditionally have lower iron stores and lower HBs because of periods. Women run a lot lower and are able to get down to a lot lower before the symptoms start hitting them. But yeah.
And again, I think there's often that perception that the only thing that's going to sort that out would be surgery and a hysterectomy, and it's I mean that can be part of the options, but it's a way down the list, isn't it?
It is. I mean, and before we even get to hysterectomy, we've got things like endometrial ablation, which is removing the lining of the womb, which is a day surgery procedure in most places, or outpatients for some. And so that's just taking the lining. If the bleeding is persistent and it is really not settling, you can try and take the lining all the way back down to the bottom layer so it doesn't grow up again. And that's for people in the perimenopause really more than the postmenopause. But hysterectomy, if you look at the rates of hysterectomy in the UK, particularly since the Mirena came in and other things came in, they've gone right down. So hysterectomy is way down the list of things.
Yeah. And would I be right in thinking so too would be what the term chemical menopause? Is that something again that is quite a way down the list? There's plenty of things to not experiment, but to look at before that. I
mean, and sort of putting someone into a chemical menopause may be something we do if you've got lots of large fibroids, or if you've got something like endometriosis, but not if people have just got this perimenopausal bleeding. Yeah.
I think it's amazing, isn't it? Within a subject that was taboo for such a long time, menopause in general, often the bleeding and this aspect of things remains something that women are really uncomfortable to talk about,
Yeah.
and yet can be so easily sorted out, but and so miserable if
Yeah.
you're the one who's living with it.
Yeah.
And again, it's why it's so important that you're here. So Anne's just asking, feels like the frequent bleeding she's experiencing while trying to get that HRT right is actually beginning to physically irritate the vagina. Is that common?
It can be. And we know that if you have lots of bleeding or lots of little bits of bleeding, using the sanitary protection or Moon Cup or anything really can be irritating. And you can also be more at risk of bacterial vaginosis as well, and candida, because the flora is different in the vagina with the bleeding. It changes how it is, the pH and things. So it can be irritating. So yes, it is common.
Okay.
I would say using something like Balance Active, which is a gel that's got lactobacilla in it, might be useful around this time, but also looking at the sanitary products and making sure that they're either reusable or they're cotton, they haven't got any chemicals in, even though lots of them are bleached white, which can, so that they look aesthetically nice, but they can irritate as well. And you can get things like contact dermatitis around this time as well.
And presumably all the kind of basic hygiene was info about not using perfumed soaps and all that kind of thing.
Absolutely no douching.
Yeah, gosh.
Yeah.
Sue's asking, so how much extra progesterone, is there a kind of ratio you go as you're upping the estrogen that you reckon you need to up the progesterone as well?
So it depends what you're on. So if you were if I use Everil Conti as a patch, so that's got the 2 hormones in it. If we wanted to give someone 100 milligrams of estrogen, so you'd use 2 Everil Conti patches rather than Everil Conti 50 and add a 50 patch. If you were using Utigestan, you'd probably increase it from 100 milligrams to 200 milligrams or up to 400 if you're using it cyclically. So it depends how much you go up. Right. So it really does, it's a conversation you need to have with someone. And also some people may have more risk factors than others for endometrial abnormalities that we might be worried about. So if someone was maybe poorly controlled diabetic or was very overweight, those are things that we know can cause problems with the lining of the womb. So we might tailor things a bit differently for certain people. But it definitely is a conversation with your doctor or your nurse.
It's not a sponge cake recipe, is it? Where you're kind of mixing up your your 8, 4. No, okay. Now I know, Nikki, we are coming up to 13 minutes to, Nikki, and you did mention you can pull over if you needed to ask your question. I just don't want you to miss it, Nikki. So think about where you are on your journey. If you need to pull over to ask your question, do. Now, the other thing that was just coming up, I've just come back from the International Menopause Conference in Lisbon, and we're looking there at all kinds of, there were obviously lots of exhibitors looking at all kinds of different, I suppose, non-HRT preparations. One that I've heard an awful lot about, or 2 actually, that I haven't really, I want to find out a bit more about. Don't know if you've got any info on them. Intrarosa was one, and also Ephemer. And just wondered if you'd had any experience with either or both.
So definitely got some experience with Intrarosa. So Intrarosa is instead of vaginal estrogens, and it's DHEA, so it's a precursor to testosterone, which is then a precursor to estrogen. So we use that in the clinic, and we use that for women with vaginal atrophy and dryness if estrogen hasn't helped. And it's used instead of estrogen vaginally, and it's a pessary that you use every night. It has, the company claimed that it, because it's testosterone, it has some impact on libido as well. we've had a 50-50, as with everything, in everything. We've had 50% of women have used it and found it better than estrogen that they were using and absolutely love it. 50% didn't find any difference and didn't like it. So it's really individual. It's because it's quite new. It's normally on limited formulary, so if it's difficult to get hold of in some places. We didn't have any side effects over and above anything that we've had with vaginal estrogen. So it was mainly like the application. People didn't like putting it in. They didn't like the consistency of the pessary because it's sort of a bit of an oily pessary. So there was just practical things that people didn't like about it. But it's definitely a useful thing if someone is finding that the vaginal estrogens like the Vagifem or the Vagirux, love the names because why can't we have something more simple, or the Invagis? If people are finding they haven't helped, then you can try something else, which is a different formulary. So it works in a slightly different way and it doesn't have an impact on bleeding.
It's horses for courses, isn't it? Again, I think I really like the point that you made, that just because something isn't necessarily flavour of the month doesn't mean it's not efficacious. If it works for you and you feel good on it, go for it.
I definitely think so. I would say I wouldn't be swayed by what every celebrity is using or everyone's saying is the greatest thing, because it is really individual and you need to get your quality of life back in some way. And everything that we take, there's also, when you look at blood pressure medication, there's stuff that's newer and supposedly better, but people find side effects and go back to older medications. So it's exactly the same with HRT.
Yeah. Nikki, you look like you're not in a car. You look like you're safe. Go for it then, Nikki. Lovely. Good to see you. Oh, where you going? Did I ask you to? Oh, no. What did I do? There you are. Hi, Nikki. Go ahead.
Hi.
There you are. Beautiful.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm trying.
Yeah.
Oh, you can hear me. Okay, brilliant. So thank you, Debbie. Thank you for holding on. My issue is I've been taking HRT since last April. I started on Everil Sequi, and then I was swayed by what everyone else was saying. So I insisted on having the Estrogel and the Utrogestan because I thought that was the latest and the greatest. I wasn't really getting any relief, and I ended up seeing a private menopause doctor, and they suggested I go back on the Estradot because they thought I wasn't absorbing the Estrogel. I've been taking Estradot and the Utrogestan, been feeling a lot better. But then this summer, I've now started bleeding twice a month for the past 3 months. Now, so I'm 52. Prior to perimenopause, I had very irregular periods. So when I was trying to get pregnant, I was day 39, 42s, whatever. And in my perimenopause, I've become 28-day girl, almost perfect periods, but that for me is irregular. So now was used to having my 28 days, and now I'm having one every 2 weeks. So they sent me off, they blue lighted me for an ultrasound, as exactly as you described. And I've been to see somebody as a result that I've got a thickening of my womb. I'm going for a hysteroscopy next Wednesday, and I'm glad that you've said it's okay to go. I feel better that you've said that. My thought at the moment is I'm on 1,000 or 100, whatever it is, the biggest dose of Estradiol that I can go on. My question is, should I be halving my estrogen? Because I'm almost sure I've got too much estrogen.
So you might need to, and if you're on sequential as well, the scan thickening will depend on where you were in your cycle, but you might need to up the Utrogestan or decrease the estrogen or think about a Mirena. So yes, so I think yeah, and if you're having 2 bleeds a month, then you're definitely, there's something not quite right in the amount that you're taking. So yeah, but should
I do anything before I have the hysteroscopy, or should I wait? Should I just leave everything as it is, have the hysteroscopy, get the biopsy results, and then we know what we're looking at?
Yeah, I think don't change anything now. Wait for the hysteroscopy, because the other thing with a thickened endometrium is sometimes we find it says it's thickened, and actually when we look inside, it's a polyp. And that can sometimes be a little bit difficult to see in some people. So I would have the hysteroscopy, see what's going on, see what's there, and then think about changing the HRT around, unless you think you want a Mirena, then have that put in at the same point as a hysteroscopy.
Yeah, I was a bit reluctant to do the Mirena because I've never really done anything like that from a contraceptive perspective.
Yeah.
So I just kind of thought, at 52, really, do I have to have my first coil?
Yeah.
But you think that could be effective, particularly for my problem?
If you were wanting to, if you need to carry on with the 100 of the estrogen, if that sorts your symptoms out, then the Mirena is an easy way to get the progesterone, the correct amount.
Okay. Okay. I think I could probably go down on my estrogen because I think there were other things going on for me, and I think I just kept throwing HRT at it because I thought that was the bulk of my problem. But okay, so I'll just wait for the results. And she did say to have a blood test, but again, should I have the blood test before the hysteroscopy or after, or would it not make any difference?
It won't make any difference. So whenever you have that, that won't make any difference.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Nikki. I hope you don't get a speeding ticket. Yeah. Oh, lovely. Here's one from Teresa saying, sorry to have missed this masterclass. Just got home from having a hysteroscopy, biopsy, and a Mirena put in. Busy day, Teresa. Happy days. We'll listen up and catch up. Brilliant stuff. And Rose, very insightful discussion. Thank you very much. Are the CPD points attached or a certificate of attendance? Rose, it's for lay people, but if you need something for your CPD, email me and I will produce something for you. Lots of lovely comments coming in. We have got about 2 minutes before people start joining for the reflexology class, and also to let you know at 8:40 we've got Back to Basics with Gail, and we're looking at heart disease and bone health later on. If there are questions, quickly get your hands up or pop them in the chat, whilst I am going to take a few minutes to thank, well, first of all, thank Rowena for nagging me to find somebody at the BMS to do this talk. And Debbie, thank you. I know, you do very long days in your clinics. Life is incredibly busy for you, but I hope you can certainly see how much reassurance you've given women this evening. This will get more and more people watching on Catch Up, and it absolutely helps us answer questions that will come up in the future. It's just a brilliant resource, and we couldn't be more grateful to you for giving us your time. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. And just if people can be reassured that they can get their bleeding investigated, I think that's a really good thing, that people can think, oh, I can go off and get it investigated, and not have that fear that it's going to be cancer and they're going to do a hysterectomy. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And I'm assuming, I mean, I know your clinic is quite a specialist clinic. Are there other bleeding clinics? So I've got 3 separate things. I've got menopause going on, and then I've got my hysteroscopy stuff going on, and then I've got a clinic for women with a bleeding disorder, so like von Willebrand's disease. That's a very specialist one that only happens if you've got a haemophilia centre, essentially. But so I see people from all sorts of things, but in my general gynae hysteroscopy clinic, it's anyone that would go and see their GP that's having some bleeding issues. Okay. Thank you very much. Debbie Holloway, absolutely brilliant session. Thank you very, very much indeed. And yeah, more lovely comments, just what I needed to hear. I mean, just how lovely is that to know you can go away having given women peace of mind this evening. Yeah, we are massively grateful. Rowena and Debbie, thank you both very, very much. Thank you, ladies, for joining us. We will produce some write-up after this and get that emailed out to you all. And again, have a lovely evening, everybody. Thanks so much, Debbie. Have a good evening, Rowena. Good night, everyone.